breaking the law is wrong, but we are governed by consent. And it may be that the war on the motorist is breaking that consent. A police investigation has revealed that an estimated 2 million people could be doctoring their number plates to avoid ULEZ and speeding fines. Apparently, on the internet, you can buy fake number plates for as little as £10. This is straightforwardly illegal, don't be any doubt about that. But you can also buy what is known as reflective stealth tape that makes the plates invisible to ULEZ or speeding cameras. Perhaps the breakdown of consent is coming because the laws are too onerous. When you repeatedly make motorists' lives more difficult by forcing them to pootle along at 20 miles an hour on an empty road in the middle of the night, or indeed impoverish them by charging them £12.50 every day for driving an older vehicle, is it surprising that this leads to civil disobedience, which is nonetheless criminal? Apparently the Home Secretary is under pressure to tackle this problem, but I have a feeling she may be rather busy with the migrant crisis first. Anyway, who better to discuss this with than Nick Freeman, Mr Loophole himself, the motoring law expert. Nick, thank you as always for joining me. It's very clear, isn't it, that putting on somebody else's number plate or a number plate that has the letters the wrong way around is straightforwardly illegal. What about putting a see-through cover that doesn't distort the numbers and letters for ordinary vision but does for cameras? Is that legal or illegal?
Illegal. If you tamper with your number plate in any respect to try and avoid the consequence of going through a camera or attempting to the court, and if you're caught, you'll be interviewed, you'll be charged, and you can expect a custodial sentence.
So it's a really stupid thing to do because you go from a risk of 3 points or a modest fine to potentially a jail sentence if you muddle with your a number plate to avoid justice.
Absolutely. I mean, you may recall the case of Freeman and his wife who just lied about who was driving. It was a straightforward three-pointer, and they both went to prison. So I think people don't realise how serious number plate tampering or being dishonest in relation to simple matters such as who was driving is. The courts deal with it very strictly. Because basically we are reliant on robotical policing now, and the public are expected to go along with it. And in my view, obviously, it will be extremely foolish for anyone to tamper with a number plate because they're going to land themselves eventually in very deep water. The authorities will catch up with them.
But this is the problem, isn't it? That it seems as if the law has become so draconian that the consent for it is breaking down, that whereas 30 years ago, before there were speed cameras, this didn't happen. People accepted that if they were stopped by the police, if they were pulled over, it was essentially fair. But with hundreds of thousands of fines being issued automatically, with no real court process involved, aren't people beginning to think that it is no longer fair and that the government by consent is crucial to a law-abiding society?
Yes, you're absolutely right. It used to be perceived as fair game. And of course, if you were stopped for speeding, 30 years ago or even less than that, an officer would exercise his discretion and you may get a warning. And you drive off having been given that warning, and you tend to drive carefully for some time. Now it's robotical. The cameras are literally everywhere. As you say, the speed limits are coming down to a level which the motorist doesn't really understand. And then when you couple that with ULEZ, congestion charges, and then couple that with the fact that we are living in largely a decriminalised society. Unless you're a motorist, the motorist feels, I think now, that it's going or it's gone too far, and they're beginning to resist the law. They're beginning to take the matter into their own hands because they say it's too much.
Thank you so much for joining me. I've still got my panel with me, author and trade union activist Paul Emery and the former editor of LabourList, Peter Edwards. Paul, I thought what Nick was saying is his very last point, is that we are becoming a decriminalised society. Yesterday we discussed shoplifting, and it seems you can get away with shoplifting. The only people left who ever get caught is the poor old motorist. So it's not surprising that the motorist who, in most cases, in all other ways law-abiding, is getting pretty fed up with this.
I mean, I'm not particularly a car fan. I have a car. I am a motorist. I don't particularly like cars. I don't think our country is particularly designed for so many of them. But nonetheless, I am concerned over schemes like ULEZ, which are, during a cost of living crisis, in the midst of a cost of living crisis, come as a real financial punishment to people. So I think the timing is pretty poor, even though it's a Labour mayor who's done it. Because people are at the moment kind of struggling to make ends meet. And the other point is, unless you have a public transport system worthy of the name, so where people can feel comfortable about travelling on public transport, it's cheap, it's reliable, it's efficient. We don't have that. We don't have it in London, we don't have it anywhere.
And we're never going to have it in places like North East Somerset, that in rural areas there is no way of having an affordable public transport service.
Well, I mean, we can go back to the beaching cuts, can't we, in the 1960s and the impact of that on the country. And arguably, you're probably right, that kind of thing isn't going to be reversed. But I certainly think we can do better than we're doing in terms of a public transport system, because if people felt that they were able to get from A to B, whether they're commuters or whatever, and to do so cheaply and quickly, I think more people would do it. They don't have trust, so therefore they feel forced to get in their cars and being punished for it.
Peter, at the heart of this, I think, is the question of justice. That, as I was discussing with Nick, that if you were pulled over by a policeman, you thought that was fair and there was discretion. But when it becomes completely automated, there's no ability to find out whether what was happening was reasonable or not, whether it was excessive. And it does begin to look like just an extra tax rather than really being a safety or a crime-related measure.
I do think so. Speeding tends to be pretty black and white, for example. There's little ambiguity about speeding. I think there's two issues here. One is around consent and the undermining of law and order. And I understand the points Nick Freeman made, but we've also got to take account of the fact of austerity and the closing of several hundred police stations since 2010 in weakening public support and faith in law and order. But to go to ULEZ, you used the word justice, which is very interesting, because I think although we're all on different sides of the political spectrum, justice is what kind of drives our engagement in politics. ULEZ, to me, however unpalatable, is a social good, it's socially just. And my worry was that the mitigation, which was a scrappage scheme, was not enough. And then after the Uxbridge by-election and a few words from Keir Starmer, Sadiq Khan, the London mayor, came out of a larger scrappage scheme, put another £50 million into it. There's a bigger economic mitigation for the people affected. But ULEZ is a moral good, and we have to remember a little girl died and had air pollution named on her death certificate, and that's why I firmly believe in it. But
the statistics on ULEZ show that the extension will make virtually no difference. If I remember rightly, it's 0.1% of particulates and 1.4% of nitrate oxides.
Yes, but that's a projection, first of all, and we don't know about demographic change in future. And I would defy anyone to argue against measures to improve air quality in London, because it will get worse.
Proportionality, surely
it's about proportion, isn't it? You know, when you look at net zero, for example, we can all be environmentalists, and I'm as green as anybody, and I don't like pollution, and I wish the air was cleaner. But there comes a point where you think, actually, politicians are just preening, they're just posturing. They know actually the impact is going to be minimal, but they want to be able to strut on the domestic stage and the international stage and say, look, you know, we're complying with the green agenda, aren't we wonderful, progressive people? There's a hell of a lot of posturing going on in this debate.
I would,
you know that.
All politicians like posturing to a certain extent, Jacob, if you forgive me for saying, but it's evidence-based. The Times, which, you know, isn't the Times newspaper, is not a woke, socialist, cheese-eating surrender monkey like I'm perceived as, but the Times did an investigation.
Fairly liberal, progressive paper.
The Times did an investigation on air quality, so data led showing children growing up in the inner city had smaller lungs. It wasn't just they had a bit of a cough or the air was a bit nastier. Their lungs were smaller in the inner city in London because of air quality. And that was by the Times newspaper, which, is from a very different political agenda to Sadiq Khan. The other thing I think we've got to show briefly, much like with tobacco 80 or 100 years ago, we've got to show humility in the face of the future, because I'm certain we're going to have more respiratory illnesses as time goes on. We can't say everything is fine, we'll all have healthy lungs in 50 years' time. There'll be more horror stories about air quality and about respiratory.
What about the people who are going to die? What about the people who are going to die of hypothermia because they won't be able to heat their homes potentially? I mean, these swings and roundabouts in many ways, isn't it? Because the idea that by hurtling towards net zero there won't be consequences there in terms of people's health and well-being is naive.
I think that's a very fair point.